This is Mark Laux, Extension Wheat Scientist with The Ohio State University. This video is about managing cressleaf groundsel to avoid problems in hay and pasture because of some of the issues we've had over the past couple of years. Those issues have really developed because cressleaf groundsel, being a winter annual, doesn't flower until sometime in May, and that's when it becomes evident in the hay stand or in a pasture, and it's toxic to animals. The hay is toxic, the silage is toxic, or if it's in a pasture and the animals eat it. And so at this point, when it's discovered, there are questions about, how can I harvest this field? Is there anything I can do with this? And really, at this point, there isn't anything you can do if you try to kill it. And the herbicides that we have for alfalfa are not that effective. You still have toxic skeletons. So really, at this point, the only solution is to either not harvest these areas of the field or harvest it and throw that hay away. You can't sell it. The goal of this video and what we have in here today is to cover some of the issues and how you can prevent this. So it's toxic to animals in hay, silage, and in pasture. It's not evident until late spring when it becomes tall enough and the yellow flowers are obvious, at which point it's too late to do anything about it. That's a situation we're trying to prevent. Toxicity is due to pyrrolizidine alkaloids, or PAs, which are in the plant its entire life cycle. It has its highest levels throughout the plant during the bud to flower stage and typically in the flower areas and in the new growth. The PAs are not destroyed by hay curing or in silage or any other post-harvest processes that happen. And typically in a pasture, it's not something that's terribly palatable to animals, and so they're not necessarily going to ingest it. And if you have very low amounts in a hayfield, it's not necessarily an issue. But it is hay containing significant amounts of groundsel that poses the highest risk. The poisoning is not necessarily immediately noticeable because they're eating hay over a period of days to months, and it may have varying amounts in it. And then also the effect on the liver is cumulative because of that. And eventually then you get into symptoms, which are depression, loss of appetite, head pressing and coordination, rectal straining, and it becomes more evident. Just to let you know, we haven't had we've had some instances where poisoning of animals with cressleaf groundsel has been suspected. I'm not sure we've really confirmed any, but this is an issue that we want to be on the front end of and really avoid. One of the questions we get as extension professionals, the county people get it, I get it, is, okay, I have this in here. Is there some level of infestation that actually allows me to go ahead and harvest and feed or sell that hay? And we're not really in the business of making that decision. We could say that in this particular instance, as you can see here, a highly infested area on the left and then an area on the right of the same field that just has a few plants in it here and there. And, we could say, okay, your decision could be to harvest the areas that look like the one on the right side of the screen and not harvest the ones on the left, or discard that hay. So that's fairly easy. It's not necessarily that easy, and we're not, it's really hard for us to make the call. So you can have a situation more like this, where you have areas that are actually highly infested, and then you have areas that still have a considerable amount but maybe not quite as much, and so the decision becomes more difficult. And we are always going to err on the side of no. You don't want to poison any animals, so be on the safe side of this and don't harvest areas that have much of an infestation. Cressleaf groundsel is a winter annual, so its life cycle is from about September through May. Reproduces from seed only, so there's no below ground parts. It emerges in the fall. Usually that's complete, mid-October, so end of October. Overwinters as a low-growing rosette and then regrows in the spring, and then flowers and sets seed in May, and then it ends its life cycle. So it doesn't persist past the first hay cutting. At that point, you're either going to cut it off, or it's going to go ahead and finish its life cycle, and then you won't see the next plants until they emerge in the fall again. Seed or windborne, like they are with mare's tails, so you can have considerable spread when you have a big infestation. And like a lot of other winter annuals, cressleaf groundsel seed lacks dormancy, like chickweed and purple dead nettle and mare's tail, so that if you do have a lot go to seed, you're probably going to have the potential to have an immediate new big infestation. Conversely, their seed doesn't last that long in soil, so if you do a good job at controlling it and have a thick stand of hay, it's probably not going to do very well after about another year. There's some photos here for identification. The fall seedlings initially have rounded tipped leaves with no lobes, and then they become lobed lobed, and the lobes have serrations or toothed margins. The plant can be all purple, mostly green, or both. The stems are hollow and grooved, and that is one of the distinguishing characteristics of telling this from some other weeds where you see the hollow stem. The entire plant doesn't have any hair, and then of course, although it's too late really to do anything for control, by the time you get the bright yellow flowers, it's pretty evident what it is, not only in hayfields, but in a lot of no-till fields that get a late burn down, no-till corn and soybean fields. So it's similar to others plants in the aster family with about a third to three-quarter of an inch bright yellow rays on the flowers. So this is just some photos to illustrate this. This is what you might see in the fall after it first comes up, and you can see the plant on the left starting to develop some lobes, but the early leaves down underneath are mostly rounded, and then you can see the lobing develop. And these are plants that could be low growing and survive the winter. And then you come into the next spring and you start to see the rosette expanding, and then you'll eventually see the stem come out and the stem elongation. And these plants, greenhouse grown, are mostly green, but we have seen plenty that are mostly purple. So there's the whole range. And then this is what the mature plant looks like, and it can get several feet tall and have clusters of flowers, and again with a hollow groove stem. One of the weeds that, especially early, this can be confused with is yellow rocket, and there are some key differences between this and yellow rocket. So we have that in our fact sheet on groundsel, and that kind of explains some of that. And there's your flowers. So your management program is really to minimize its occurrence in hayfields, pasture, where it could lead to livestock poisoning. You could expand that and say we don't want it going to seed in roadsides or in no-till fields. Corn and soybean fields, that might be adjacent, because that's a source of seed in a hayfield and a pasture also. So what we're trying to encourage is to scout and apply control measures in fall ideally, or early spring if you don't get it in the fall when the plants are small and most susceptible to control. Again, you're trying to avoid a couple of things, and one of the main things is you can kill a plant that has some size to it, in some cases with something like glyphosate and Roundup Ready alfalfa, but the skeleton will be there, and it doesn't necessarily do away with the toxicity. So you're largely trying to prevent the occurrence in that first hay cutting, and you're also, a secondary goal is certainly to prevent seed production to limit future infestations. So we're recommending to scout in early October when you should see it, and then again in late March. If you do see it in October and you implement control measures, you really shouldn't have it in March, because it doesn't emerge. New plants don't emerge over the winter. A well-managed dense hay stand should really keep it from being much of an issue. And so conversely, if you look at a field that has a history of problems where you had a lot of seed, or you have an August seeding where it's emerging with the seeding and you don't have that dense stand yet to keep it from being a problem. And also in these situations where you have a thin stand, because we always have most of our weed problems in those particular situations. That's not to say you shouldn't scout all your hay fields, because it's a problem if it shows up in a well-managed hay field, but this is your more likely situations. Most easily controlled with herbicides, especially in late fall, but also early spring. And after the stem bolts and it has any size to it, it just gets way more difficult to control in the spring. You can use frequent mowing, but there's two parts of this. One is you could obviously mow large plants and they're probably not going to come back, but you're going to have large plants that you've mowed that are there and you still can't be harvested. So the idea would be you would mow an area of mow that it never just gets cressleaf groundsel plants of any size, and I'm not sure how that really integrates with the way that we produce hay, but that's certainly one way you could do that. Grass, hay, and pasture, we just recommend 2,4-D. There are other more expensive herbicides that work, but you don't need them necessarily for cressleaf groundsel, and ester may be more effective than amine. And ideally you want the rosettes less than several inches in diameter. Once you start to get some stem elongation or larger plants, you can add dicamba, or use a 2,4-D dicamba premix, and that would be more likely that you would have to do that in the spring. And I'll just say that if you do anything early in the fall or early spring, you're pretty much in good shape with intervals to come back and harvest with regard to what the label says about how long you have to wait between application and harvest to minimize any potential residues in the hay. And you can see here it's 7 days for 2,4-D, 7 days for lactating animals and 37 days for cut hay for the premix, and then dicamba. It depends on rate, but if you're going to use a lowish rate and put it with 2,4-D, then it would be on the order of the 7 days or the 37 days, not the 40 and the 70. Your options are more limited in alfalfa and alfalfa grass hay for a couple reasons. One is that almost anything you use is going to impact the grass that's in a mixed stand. And then you have more options in an established stand than you do in a new seeding. So you have the dormant treatment in late February of metribuzin or Velpar, and established stands only, which means more than a year old. Metribuzin can actually be used in an alfalfa grass stand and won't hurt most grasses, not the Velpar. The Velpar will injure or kill the grasses. And Velpar has long residual, so you can't rotate to other crops for 2 years. But this is generally a very effective, even the metribuzin at the 1.3 pounds of 75 DF is a very effective dormant treatment for a number of different weeds and has some impact on dandelion as well. If you're in Roundup Ready alfalfa, you can certainly use glyphosate, 0.75 to 1.5 pounds. It's still more effective in the fall probably than it is in the spring. Label says weeds less than 6 inches tall, but you would want to be smaller than ideally, and then you have a very short period between application and cutting or grazing. You can also use a glyphosate spot treatment in non-Roundup Ready alfalfa as an emergency. It'll obviously impact all the desirable species in the area as well as the weeds. And then your other option would be Pursuit, which suppresses or controls depending on size. Fall is more effective. You can use it in seedling or established alfalfa as long as it has at least 2 trifoliates. But it will have an impact on any desirable grasses that you have there. Pursuit's not amazing on perennial grasses, and so they may actually survive, but it'll probably have cause some injury. Ideally, the rosette stage of the weed, and certainly not more than 3 inches tall. And it is sensitive to weather, both fall and spring, but especially in spring when we're just generally cold. And so you're looking for a period of warmer weather above 60 degrees during the day and hopefully not too cold at night. And then Pursuit obviously goes with recommended adjuvants, and those are in the weed control guide and also can be found on the label. So that's what we're recommending, that you try to get ahead of this issue. Not every hayfield has it, and especially well-managed established hayfields probably don't. But you certainly don't want to get caught in the spring with an infested field and have nothing that you can do with the hay in those areas. This slide just shows our resources, and always feel free to contact us for more information if you need to, or your local county extension educator.